Thank you, distinguished co-chairs. Pakistan aligns itself with the statement made by the permanent representative of Italy on behalf of the Uniting for Consensus group. We congratulate you, Ambassador Albanese and Ambassador Masjid, on your reappointment as co-chairs and for the progress made during the previous IGN cycle in enlarging the convergences as reflected in the last Common Elements paper and in the Pact for the Future. Co-chairs, it is essential to reiterate at this stage the scope of the convergences we have achieved, as reflected in the Common Elements paper, in the Pact of the Future, and also in the informal exchanges, so-called tactile talks that we have had. I would like to list what I consider to be these convergences. One, there is agreement to enlarge the number of two-year non-permanent seats in an expanded Security Council. There is, however, no convergence on the addition of additional permanent members. Two, the representation of developing countries must be enlarged. Three, the regional approach offers the best basis for equitable representation on an expanded council. Four, special priority should be accorded to redressing the historic injustice against Africa and other underrepresented regions, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, while also accommodating the equitable representation of cross-regional groups such as the SIDS, the Arab Group, and the OIC. Five, a consolidated model should be based on the convergences in all five interlinked clusters. We should curb our enthusiasm in accelerating the presentation of a consolidated model until the existing divergences on size, categories, veto, regional representation, and working methods have been overcome and reconciled through the IGN process. Six, the IGN process is the only and the best mechanism through which agreement can be reached on the five clusters and other elements of Security Council reform. The IGN's credibility should not be called into question. We have made considerable progress, and any lack of progress is due to the inflexibility and individual ambitions of certain states. 7, text-based negotiations can only commence once the divergences on the five clusters have been reconciled and a consolidated model has been developed. 8, while the Pact seeks early reform, no artificial or arbitrary deadline has been set for a decision on Security Council reform. 124 leaders called for urgent reform, but they did not agree on a common model for reform as yet. 9, any decision on reform must be based on the widest possible agreement among member states. That is, in our view, on the basis of consensus as set out in our decision 62557. And 10, any attempt to impose a unilateral decision, as some have threatened, will divide the UN membership, destroy the IGN process, and the prospect of early reform of the Security Council. Co-chairs, I would submit that we should consider these the 10 commandments to guide our work in the IGN. Co-chairs, we are happy to commence the IGN process this year with an in-depth discussion on the categories of membership. It is clear that the proposals advanced on categories entail not two, but several categories or forms of membership. Non-permanent seats with 2-year terms on which there is agreement. Non-permanent longer-term seats, the compromise offered by the UFC. Permanent members with veto, proposed by the G4 and the L69. Permanent members without veto, as implied by some of the G4 and one permanent member. Permanent seats for regions with veto, as proposed by the African group. Rotating members against permanent or special seats for regions, as outlined in some statements. Thus, the divergences on categories cannot be fallaciously simplified into permanent and non-permanent categories. There is a much larger menu, and there is a possibility of mixing and matching. Co-chairs, the UFC remains firmly opposed to proposals for permanent seats for individual member states. There is no justification for the creation of new centers of privilege within the United Nations, contrary to the principle of sovereign equality of member states. There are no states which can justifiably claim such unequal status under the Charter. Any country seeking a more frequent presence on the Security Council should do so by subjecting itself to the democratic process of periodic election by the General Assembly. This would also make the Security Council more accountable. Consistent references continue to be made by the aspirants for permanent membership to so-called new realities. They assert, or at least imply, that they have greater capacity and willingness to contribute to international peace and security. But there are more than 4 or even 6 states with such so-called greater capacity to contribute to international peace and security. At least over 20 states by my count, the middle powers, many of which are even today making greater contributions to peace and security than the 4 aspirants for permanent membership. Co-chairs, the UFC continues to believe that its proposal for an expansion of Security Council membership to 26 or 27 with the addition of 11 or 12 new non-permanent members offers the best basis for Security Council reform. The UFC's proposal to add only non-permanent members elected periodically by the General Assembly is democratic and consistent with the Charter's prescription that the Security Council, and I quote, acts on behalf, unquote, of the entire membership of the General Assembly. And this membership are mostly small and medium-sized states. The UFC proposal will also ensure equitable representation, the key objective of Security Council reform. Today, co-chairs, with deep divisions among the permanent members, it is the E10, the non-permanent members of the Council, who have taken the lead in fulfilling the responsibilities of the Security Council. I hope the resolution they have presented today will not be vetoed. On Gaza, a larger number of non-permanent members will add dynamism to the work of the Security Council and balance the influence and bridge the differences between the permanent members. On the other hand, if 6 additional permanent members are included in the Council, it will mathematically reduce the prospects for representation for the rest of the 182 UN member states. It would undermine equitable regional representation also by precluding the opportunity for other member states from that region to be represented on the Council. Moreover, new individual permanent members would expand the Game of Thrones in the Security Council and intensify the prospects of its paralysis and dysfunction. Co-chairs, the UFC group is sensitive to and supportive of Africa's legitimate quest to rectify the historic injustice against Africa as reflected in the Common African Position. This has been acknowledged as a special priority. There are similar injustices against other groups. The 57 member states of Asia are also underrepresented, as is Latin America. An equitable geographical representation implies that there is no reason to add any further seats for Europe, much less a permanent seat as proposed by the G4 and the L69 groups. We believe that the UFC's proposal regarding regional representation can contribute to redressing such historic injustices against the regions of the developing world. Under our proposal, regions could determine the modalities for nominating their representative and their fair rotation, adhering to the principle of regional ownership. The UFC's framework could also accommodate the adequate representation of the cross-regional groups such as the SIDS, the Arab and the OIC groups, which have both special perspectives and special interests, as has been mentioned by the distinguished representatives of Bahrain, Egypt, and others here this morning. Co-chairs, we are confident that through a structured program of work, the IGN can make considerable progress this year in building on the Common Elements paper and the Pact of the Future to broaden convergences, reduce divergences, and make further steady progress towards widest possible agreement on Security Council reform. I thank you, co-chairs.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan.